Along the western bank of the Nile, in the long still hours before the first gray light begins to separate the sky from the river, a bakery sleeps. It is a cluster of low mudbrick rooms attached to the outer edge of a larger compound, a nobleman's estate perhaps, or the sprawling administrative quarter of a temple, where dozens of workers and craftspeople are housed and fed through the careful labor of those who rise earliest. The mudbrick walls are thick and close, built in the ancient way from Nile mud mixed with cut straw and dried in the sun until they hold a quiet solidity that no other material quite matches. Through the night they have absorbed the coolness of the desert air, and now, in these last hours of darkness, they hold that coolness against their inner surfaces steadily, without effort, as though coolness were simply their natural condition. The rooms are dark, not the soft dark of a clouded evening, but a deep, settled darkness that has been in place for many hours, undisturbed by anything but the occasional small sounds that belong to darkness in this part of the world. The distant movement of water against a reed bank, the brief call of a night bird somewhere over the floodplain, the faint stirring of a sleeping animal in an adjacent courtyard. The air inside the bakery carries the mingled smell of everything that has happened here across many days and many seasons. Grain dust, fired clay, ash, the faint sour sweetness of old fermentation, worked into the very surface of the walls and floors, a smell so familiar to those who sleep nearby that it has long since ceased to register as anything other than the ordinary smell of the air itself. Against one wall of the largest room, two wide cylindrical ovens stand in the darkness. They were fired the previous day as they are fired every working day, and although their fuel burned down to embers and then to cool ash many hours ago, the clay walls of the ovens still hold a memory of that heat. Pressing a hand flat against the outer surface of one of these ovens, a person would feel a faint warmth radiating outward. Not the scorching heat of active firing, but something gentler, more residual, something like the warmth that sun-warmed earth holds into the evening long after the light has gone. The clay is smooth in places, rough in others where the surface has been repaired and patched over seasons of use, and its color in daylight would be a deep reddish brown, darkened further near the mouth of each oven by years of smoke and heat. Around the base of the ovens and along the low stone shelves that run along two walls of the room, the tools of the bakery rest in the dimness. Wide, shallow baskets, woven from palm leaf strips in tight, even patterns, are stacked against one another, their rims worn smooth from handling. Wooden troughs, broad and low, hollowed from dense timber, sit empty on the floor, their inner surfaces stained with the pale residue of dried dough. Flat stone grinding slabs rest at an angle against the wall, their working surfaces visibly worn into a slight depression at the center from the long repetition of their daily use. Smaller stone tools, pestles and rubbing stones, are gathered in a clay vessel nearby. Ceramic bowls of several sizes are arranged with quiet orderliness on a shelf, their surfaces unglazed, porous, slightly rough to the touch, the color of dry river clay. Across the threshold of an inner doorway, half separated from the main working room by a low wall, several of the bakers sleep on woven mats laid directly on the swept floor. The household or temple that operates this bakery maintains a small team, men and women whose work begins before any other worker in the compound has stirred, whose day is paced not by the rising of the sun, but by the demands of fire and dough and the hunger of a large household that expects its bread to be ready well before midday. They sleep close together in the manner of people accustomed to shared quarters, their breathing slow and even. Then one of them shifts. There is a soft rustling of the woven mat, a quiet settling of movement as a woman turns, and then, after a moment, rises. She is not young and not old, somewhere in the middle span of life, with hands that bear the particular kind of roughness that comes from years of working with stone and dough and ash. She is woken at this hour so many times that her body does it without struggle, without reluctance, simply moving from sleep into wakefulness in the easy manner of long habit, as naturally as water follows the shape of a familiar channel. She locates the small oil lamp by touch, a simple ceramic dish no larger than a cupped hand, with a wick of twisted plant fiber resting in a shallow pool of oil. She uses a piece of smoldering tinder kept alive in a covered clay pot for exactly this purpose. And the lamp takes the flame gently, its small light spreading outward in a warm, amber circle that illuminates the nearest surfaces without fully disturbing the darkness beyond. The shadows pull back only a little, and the room remains largely dim. But it is enough. She stands for a moment in that lamplight, her shadow moving large and slow against the mudbrick wall behind her. The familiar smell of the bakery is around her. The faint warmth from the ovens is present at the edges of the room. The deep quiet of the Nile Valley before dawn presses gently against the outer walls of the compound, vast and still and patient, as it has been across more seasons than any single life could count. Then she moves, carrying the lamp, into the beginning of the day. A day that will unfold as this day has always unfolded here, in this place, in this work, step by patient step, from the darkness before dawn into the full, warm, grain-scented morning. She carries the lamp through a low doorway at the far end of the bakery, moving along a short passage of bare mud brick that connects the main working room to the storage area beyond. The passage is narrow enough that the warmth of the lamp travels with her in a contained way, the small flame steady in the still air, casting its amber light across the uneven surface of the walls where the dried mud has settled and cracked in fine lines over many seasons. The floor beneath her feet is packed earth, worn smooth by the passage of many mornings just like this one, and she moves along it without hesitation, knowing every slight unevenness in the ground by long familiarity. The storage room opens before her, a space somewhat quieter and cooler than the bakery itself, its thick mud brick walls holding the night's temperature a little longer than the rooms that face the courtyard. Along the walls and arranged in careful order across much of the floor, large ceramic storage jars stand upright, their rounded bellies wide and their mouths sealed with plugs of dried clay or stoppered with flat ceramic discs pressed firmly into place. Between and beside them, wide woven baskets sit in stacked formation, their lids tied down with lengths of fiber cord. There is a quality of abundance here, measured and contained, the provisions of a household or temple institution that plans carefully, that accounts for each day's consumption and each season's harvest with the same steady attention it gives to everything else. The grain inside these jars and baskets is Emmer wheat, and it has come a considerable distance, in terms of both miles and effort, before arriving at this resting place. Emmer wheat is an ancient grain, far older than the civilization that has learned to cultivate it so precisely along the banks of the Nile, and it has a quality of deep, settled permanence about it that seems appropriate to this land. The individual grains are small and compact, enclosed in tight husks that cling closely to the seed within, husks that do not release their hold easily, which is part of what makes Emmer a grain of considerable labor, requiring effort at nearly every stage of its transformation from plant to bread. In the fields of the Nile floodplain, the Emmer grows in dense low stands, its stalks shorter and stouter than some other grains, its heads heavy with the clustered, husk-bound seeds. The harvest comes in the dry months, after the inundation has receded and the rich black silt left behind by the flood has fed the growing season to its conclusion. Workers move through the fields with curved sickles, cutting the stalks close to the ground, gathering the cut grain into bundles that are then carried on wooden sleds or in large basket panniers to the threshing floor. There animals, most commonly cattle, and it is thought that other working animals may at times have assisted, are driven in slow circles over the spread stalks, their hooves breaking the heads apart, loosening the grain from its position in the plant, beginning the long process of separation. After threshing comes winnowing, the tossing of grain upward into whatever breeze the season offers, allowing the lighter chaff to drift away, while the heavier grain falls back to the surface below. This is patient, repetitive work, done in the heat of the afternoon, and it must be done more than once to achieve a reasonable degree of separation, because the Emmer's tight husks mean that the grain arrives at this stage still partially enclosed, still resistant. Further processing, additional pounding, additional sieving, works the grain toward a cleaner state, removing the largest fragments of husk and stem, though the nature of Emmer is such that some portion of the chaff remains closely bound until the grinding stone itself finishes the work of separation. From the threshing and processing area, the grain is carried to storage, transported in large baskets, or, where the fields lie at some distance, conveyed by river in whatever craft the household or institution has available. Then poured carefully into the tall ceramic storage jars that will protect it from moisture and from the small creatures that would gladly take their portion if given the opportunity. The sealed jars are marked or recorded by the household scribes, who track the quantities with the same methodical care that governs every aspect of institutional Egyptian life. Each jar represents a portion of the year's harvest, a portion of the labor of many people, a portion of what will sustain the household through the months ahead. The baker sets her lamp on a low ledge near the wall and moves to one of the larger jars. She removes the ceramic stopper with both hands, setting it carefully aside, and leans forward slightly to look at the grain within. Even in the modest lamplight, the color of the emmer is visible, a pale golden tone, the color of dry, sunlit fields, with a slightly buff warmth to it that is pleasing in a quiet way. The husks give the grain a rougher, more textured appearance than more fully processed grains might have, each small kernel encased in its tight wrapper, the whole mass of grain settling in dense layers toward the base of the jar. She reaches in with one hand and draws out a small amount, letting it rest in her open palm, feeling its weight and texture. The grains are dry and firm, which is what they should be. Any softness or dampness would suggest a problem with the seal or the storage conditions. Something to be noted and set aside. She tilts her palm slightly, letting a few grains roll, observing whether there is any unusual color or debris among them. The smell that rises from the jar is faint and pleasant, a dry, slightly nutty warmth, faintly sweet in the way that stored grain often is, carrying within it something of the field and the sun and the long months of slow growth along the river. Satisfied with what her hand and her nose have told her, she reaches for the wooden measuring scoop that hangs from a cord near the storage room entrance. The scoop is a simple implement, a smooth, broad bowl of pale wood with a short handle, its interior worn to a faint shine from long use, but it is a standardized one, a measure that corresponds to the household's accounts and ration records, so that what is taken from the store each morning is a consistent, knowable quantity. She begins to work through the familiar, deliberate process of measuring out the day's portion, scooping and counting, her movements slow and even, in the lamplight, the grain whispering softly as it falls from the scoop into the wide, shallow carrying basket she has set on the floor beside her. There is no reason to rush this part of the morning. The grinding will not begin until the grain is ready, and the grain will not be ready until this careful, deliberate measuring is complete. And so the baker moves through the storage room in the amber circle of her lamp's light, the sealed jars standing patient and full around her. The smell of emmer wheat quiet and constant in the cool air, the sounds of the waking Nile just barely audible beyond the thick walls, the whole of the morning still gathering itself, gently and without urgency, into whatever it will become. The carrying basket, now holding the measured grain for the morning, is lifted carefully and brought through the low doorway that connects the storage room to the grinding area. A longer, narrower chamber, set a little apart from the main ovens, its mudbrick walls darkened at shoulder height from the accumulated dust of many seasons. Several flat stone slabs rest on the floor here, each one slightly inclined, each worn into a shallow central depression by years of daily use. These are the saddle querns, and they have been waiting through the night in the same patient stillness as everything else in the bakery. Cool and faintly damp with the last of the pre-dawn air, their pale gray surfaces carrying the fine powdery residue of yesterday's flour in every small groove and pore of the stone. The other grinders are already moving through the doorway behind her, settling into their places with the ease of people who have made exactly these movements more mornings than they could count. There are several of them working together this morning, as there are most mornings in a bakery of this size. A household of this standing requires a great quantity of bread each day, and grinding is slow work, deliberate work, work that cannot be rushed without losing quality. Each grinder kneels or crouches at the lower end of a saddle quern, knees resting on a folded piece of cloth or a pad of woven reed matting, settling into the position that the body already knows by long habit. Small oil lamps have been placed along the walls of the grinding chamber, and their combined light fills the room with a soft amber warmth that catches the edge of each stone slab and makes the flour dust already hanging in the air glow faintly, like something between smoke and light. The grain is divided among the querns, a portion measured into each, poured from the carrying basket into a shallow wooden trough set at the upper end of each slab, from which it can be fed onto the stone gradually, a small handful at a time. A grinder takes up the handstone, a rounded oblong piece of the same dense gray stone, worn smooth on its working face, fitting into the palm and fingers in a way that feels almost natural, almost inevitable, and places it against the upper portion of the slab, where the first small scattering of emmer grain has been laid. Then the work begins. The motion is a long, slow rocking push, the handstone pressed down with the weight of the shoulders and arms, drawn forward across the face of the quern from the high end toward the low, then lifted and drawn back, then pressed forward again. It is not a fast motion. It was never meant to be a fast motion. The grain beneath the stone cracks first, the dense little kernels splitting open under pressure, and then with each subsequent pass the cracked pieces are ground smaller, reduced by slow degrees from broken grain to coarse meal, and then with patient repetition, from coarse meal to something finer, paler, softer in texture. The flour drifts and collects at the lower end of the slab, gathering into a small pale mound that falls or is brushed into the wooden trough set to catch it. The sound of this work fills the grinding chamber with a low, continuous scraping, not harsh, not sharp, but steady and deep, a sound that seems to come from the stone itself, as much as from the motion of the grinder's arms. Each pass of handstone against quern produces a long, slow rasp, slightly varying in pitch, depending on how much grain lies beneath the stone and how coarse or fine the current meal has become. When the grain is whole and first cracked, the sound is a little rougher, a little more uneven, the kernels skittering and catching before the stone finds its grip. As the grinding continues and the meal becomes finer, the sound smooths out, becomes more even, more continuous, a long, low, rhythmic scrape that moves through the amber lamplight like something almost musical, almost like breathing. The grinders work in a shared rhythm that develops naturally, without coordination, simply because the motion itself imposes its own pace. There is a slow rocking quality to the labor that settles the body into something approaching stillness, even as the arms continue to move, a meditative quality that many mornings of this same work have worn into the body's understanding of what this hour is for. The grinding chamber is warm with the lamps and with the closeness of several people working steadily in a small space, and the smell of freshly broken emmer wheat rises from each quern in a faint, dry, slightly sweet cloud. That particular smell of grain opened up, of the starchy interior of the kernel exposed to air for the first time since it was threshed and stored away. Flour gathers in the wooden troughs. It is pale, not quite white, more the color of unbleached linen held up to soft lamplight, a warm, creamy gray gold. And it has a fine texture at the surface, but carries within it, distributed invisibly, tiny fragments of stone worn from the quern in the course of the grinding. This is simply the nature of flour made this way, on these stones, by this motion. The quern gives of itself incrementally with every morning's work, and what it gives becomes part of the meal as naturally as the grain itself. The bread that will be made from this flour will be dense and nourishing, and those who eat it daily will find it sustaining through long hours of work and rest alike. In this moment, in this chamber, the flour is simply flour, warm to the touch when a hand is pressed lightly against the gathering pile in the trough, slightly gritty between the fingertips, smelling of grain and stone in the particular dusty warmth of early morning. Fresh grain is fed onto the slabs in small increments as the grinders work through each portion, the wooden trough at the upper end of each quern dispensing its measure slowly, the grinders pausing briefly to check the consistency of the meal as it collects, running a pinch of it between thumb and forefinger, feeling for the point at which the grind has become fine enough for dough, at which the meal will absorb water evenly and work smoothly under the hands. This judgment is entirely a matter of touch and accumulated knowledge, and it varies slightly depending on what the flour will be used for, a finer grind for certain loaves, a coarser meal for others. Though the grinding stone does not make such distinctions of itself, and it is the grinder's hands and attention that carry all of this knowing. The lamps burn steadily along the walls. The Nile continues its quiet passage beyond the mudbrick and the sleeping city. Present in the grinding chamber is only the faintest suggestion of sound, more a felt nearness than a heard one. Outside, the darkness has begun to soften very slightly at its edges. Not yet light, not yet anything that could be called dawn, but something in the quality of the night has shifted, some deepest part of the dark having passed, the world beginning its long, slow turn toward morning. Inside the grinding chamber, none of this is yet visible, and the amber lamplight remains the whole of the available world, warm and contained, filling the space between the stone walls with its steady, patient glow. The work continues. The handstones move in their long, slow arcs across the face of the querns. The flour gathers in pale, soft drifts at the low ends of the slabs. The sound of stone against stone fills the room with its steady, even rhythm, constant and low and deeply familiar. The sound of every morning that has come before this one, and every morning that will come after. The flour is gathered now from the troughs and shallow collecting basins where it has drifted and settled during the long grinding, and it is transferred with careful hands into the wide, low ceramic mixing bowls that have waited in a row along one side of the bakery. These bowls are old and well used, their inner surfaces smoothed by years of contact with wet dough, their pale clay walls darkened in irregular patches where the moisture of countless previous batches has soaked slowly in and dried again over time. Each bowl is broad and shallow, designed not for depth but for reach, so that the baker's hands and forearms can move freely through the mixture without obstruction, working the dough against the curved floor of the vessel with full, steady strokes. The flour, as it sits in these bowls, is still and dry, a pale, soft heap, with a texture not unlike fine river silt, though warmer and lighter, and carrying still that faint, dry, slightly dusty grain smell that has been present in the air of the grinding chamber since long before first light. It holds the slight warmth that comes from the friction of the grinding stones, a warmth so gentle it can only be felt by pressing a palm flat into the surface and waiting a moment, letting the stillness of the flour speak its temperature to the skin. In this state, it is quiet matter, inert and patient, waiting for the thing that will change it. The water was drawn the previous evening, carried in tall ceramic storage jars from the Nile itself, or from one of the broad irrigation canals that reach inland from the river, and bring its water through the cultivated land. By the time the bakers come to use it, it has rested through the night in those jars, undisturbed and still, and whatever sediment it carried from the river has long since settled slowly to the bottom, leaving the upper portion clear and calm. A baker tips a jar carefully, holding it at an angle that allows the settled water to pour from the upper part of the vessel without disturbing what is collected below, and fills a smaller handled clay cup from which the water will be added to the flour in slow, measured pours. The first addition of water is a deliberate thing. The cup is held at a low angle over the bowl, and the water falls in a thin, quiet stream, and where it meets the flour, it darkens it immediately, turning the pale surface a shade deeper, the dry grain absorbing the moisture with what seems almost like eagerness. The baker's other hand is already moving through the mixture, drawing the wet and dry portions together, and this first stage of mixing has a particular quality to it, rough, uneven, the flour clumping in damp masses around the wet areas, while the drier patches away from the water still shift like powder. The bowl fills with a sound that is part scrape and part soft compression, the baker's fingers pressing through the half-formed mixture, turning it, lifting and folding it back on itself, coaxing the dry flour into contact with the water that has settled toward the bottom of the bowl. More water is added, a little at a time, each addition preceded by a moment of assessment in which the baker reads the state of the mixture by feel alone, pressing a fist slowly into its surface, drawing a hand along its texture, judging not by any external measure, but entirely by the accumulated knowledge of hands that have done this work many hundreds of times. There is no fixed quantity that governs the water's addition, no counting or marking, only this continuous, attentive conversation between the baker and the dough as it forms. The temperature of the morning, the particular quality of this batch of flour, even the subtle differences between one day's water and another's. All of these things register in the hands and are answered with small adjustments in how much water is poured and when. As the mixing continues and the water is fully worked in, the texture of the mixture changes in a way that is gradual and then, at some point that is difficult to identify precisely, complete. What began as loose, uneven clumps gradually gathers into a single cohesive mass, heavy and dense, pulling away from the walls of the bowl and yielding a little under pressure before pushing back against the hand. The color has deepened considerably from the dry flour's pale gold to something more amber, more substantial, and the surface of the formed dough has a roughness to it, a slightly uneven sheen, still somewhat shaggy in texture and not yet fully developed. The smell has changed as well, the pure dry grain smell now carrying a faint, living note, something new and faintly warm that was not present before, a suggestion of the slow fermentation beginning to stir within the dough's patient interior. It is at this stage that the leavening is introduced. In a small covered vessel set to one side, saved carefully from the previous day's work, there is a portion of old dough that has been fermenting since yesterday morning. It is likely that this practice of reserving a portion of fermented dough was common in many bakeries of this kind, carried forward from one day's batch into the next, as a matter of quiet routine. The old dough is soft and somewhat collapsed, its surface irregular, and it carries a smell that is noticeably sour and alive in the warm air of the bakery. The baker scoops this old dough out in sections, tearing it into smaller pieces and pressing them into the newly formed mass at intervals, then folding the whole mixture over and over itself with slow, thorough motions that work the old fermented dough evenly through the new. This folding takes time and considerable effort. The dough is not light, and it resists the hands that press into it, requiring the baker's full weight behind each movement, palms driving down and forward through the mass, the bowl shifting slightly on the floor with each press. The folding continues until the baker is satisfied that the old dough has been distributed evenly through the new batch, though this too is a judgment made entirely by touch and experience, by the quality of the texture as it yields, by the slight change in how the mass responds to pressure as the fermented portion is incorporated. When it is right, the baker will know it, not by any rule that could be written down and passed along in words, but by the feel of the thing itself, dense and warm and faintly alive under the hands. The finished dough rests in its bowl, heavy and still, the surface lightly dusted with a scatter of dry flour that settled during the mixing. Across the bakery floor, several other bowls hold dough in various stages of readiness, each one the product of the same slow, attentive process, each one bearing the particular character of the hands that shaped it. The lamplight falls across the bowls and across the dough's uneven surfaces, and in this warm, flour-hazed air, with the low sound of the river carrying gently through the open doorway, the bakery settles for a time into the particular stillness of work completed and the next work not yet begun. The cloth comes down slowly over each bowl, a loose weave of linen that settles without pressing, leaving the dough beneath it room to breathe and shift as it will. Where no cloth is at hand, a flat ceramic lid is laid across the rim of the bowl, not sealed tightly, but resting easy, just enough to keep the flour dust from drifting in and to hold a little of the warmth that the dough itself begins to generate as the fermentation finds its quiet rhythm. The bakers move between the bowls in the lamplight, covering each one in turn, and then they step back, and the particular work of this hour is given over entirely to something that cannot be hurried or helped along by any further action of the hands. Fermentation is a slow and patient process, and the bakery in these early morning hours becomes a place shaped by that patience. The dough will take its own time. It will soften slightly in its interior. The gases produced by the old fermented dough working outward through the mass in ways too gradual and too fine to be seen or heard, only eventually to be understood by the slow rounding of the covered mound, a subtle lifting of the cloth as the dough below it gently expands. This change will not come for some while yet, and so the bakers turn to other things, moving through the low amber light of the bakery with the steadiness of people who have learned to occupy the spaces between larger tasks without restlessness. One of the bakers takes up a wide, flat reed brush and begins to sweep the grinding and mixing area, working the accumulated flour dust in long, slow strokes toward the edges of the mud brick floor. The flour dust is fine enough that it rises slightly with each stroke before settling again, and the lamplight catches it briefly, a pale haze drifting close to the ground, before the air stills and the dust comes to rest a little further along. This sweeping is a quiet and repetitive task, the soft sound of the brush against the floor joining the other small sounds of the bakery. A faint shift of cloth settling on a bowl, the occasional low creak of a wooden trough, the sound of the Nile still audible through the open doorway. The open doorway faces east, and the sky beyond it has begun, in the slowest possible way, to change. The deep blue-black of the night hours has softened towards something slightly less absolute, a quality of darkness that carries within it the first distant suggestion of morning, without yet being morning in any visible sense. The stars nearest the horizon are faintly less bright. The air that moves through the doorway is still cool and carries the smell of the river, that particular combination of water and silt and reed that belongs entirely to the Nile in these hours before the sun has had any chance to warm the banks or stir the shallower channels. This air moves through the bakery and mingles with what is already there, and what is already there has changed in the past hour. The smell of the bakery in these early morning moments is not yet the smell of baking, which is still a good while away, but it is no longer only the dry, neutral smell of raw flour and stone dust. The fermenting dough has begun to give off its own scent, faint at first and difficult to name precisely, a softness in the air that carries a slight sourness, not unpleasant but recognizable, the particular smell of grain in the process of becoming something different from what it was. This sourness will deepen as the morning continues and the dough rises further, and already it is woven into the warm air of the bakery, alongside the oil smoke of the lamps and the faint mineral coolness still held in the mud brick walls. Another baker refills the small oil lamps that have been burning since the beginning of the day's work, tilting a narrow-spouted ceramic vessel carefully to bring the level of oil back up in each lamp's shallow basin. The flames dip and recover as the oil settles, and for a moment the shadows in the bakery shift and move, before returning to their familiar positions. The lamps are simple things, fired clay shaped into a shallow cup with a pinched lip to hold the wick, but they have been doing this work reliably for the entirety of the morning, and they will continue to do so until the daylight is strong enough that they are no longer needed. Water must also be carried, several full jars brought from the storage area, where the previous evening's drawing from the canal sits settled and clear, and set near the mixing area in readiness for the next stage of work. The bakers carry these jars with both hands, moving carefully across the floor, and the water inside shifts with each step, a low sound against the ceramic. The jars are heavy and cool to the touch, and the bakers set them down with a soft deliberateness, the ease of people entirely accustomed to the weight and the work. Outside, the birds have begun, first one, then several, then a sound that is less individual than general, a gradual filling of the air beyond the bakery walls with the soft, scattered calls of the birds that nest along the Nile's edge and in the papyrus stands and in the damp grasses of the bank. These sounds drift in through the open doorway as easily as the cool air does, gentle and continuous, the sound of the world outside resuming its own daily rhythms, just as the bakery is resuming its own. The two sounds, the bakery's quiet interior work and the birds' soft chorus beyond the walls, exist alongside one another without interference. Beneath their coverings of cloth and ceramic, the dough masses rest and slowly, imperceptibly change. The bakers move through the low light. The sourness in the air deepens by the smallest degrees. The sky beyond the doorway continues its long, patient movement toward morning. When the dough has rested long enough, and the bakers know this not by any counting of time, but by the feel of the surface of each covered mass when pressed lightly with a fingertip, a soft resistance that gives just slightly and then holds, a quality that takes years of mornings to recognize with certainty. The cloths and ceramic lids are lifted away, one by one, and the work of shaping begins. The fermented dough has changed in its rest. Where it was once dense and heavy and reluctant, it has become something more yielding, more alive to the touch, faintly puffed at its edges, where the fermentation has worked most actively. A faint sourness rises from each uncovered bowl, warmer than the air of the bakery, carrying the particular smell of grain that has been quietly transforming through the early hours. The bakers lean briefly over each bowl as they uncover it, and this gesture, though almost unconscious, carries within it a practiced reading of the dough's readiness, its smell and appearance and the slight warmth rising from it all, offering information that is absorbed without being formally considered. The first step is dividing. A baker takes hold of the dough in a wide, flat ceramic bowl and begins to portion it with practiced hands, pulling sections away from the main mass with a steady, deliberate motion, using both palms and fingers together in a way that is less a tearing than a coaxing apart. Each portion is set onto the wide stone work surface or onto a flat wooden board dusted lightly with flour, and the portions are arranged with a loose regularity, enough space between them that they will not press together and merge again while the shaping proceeds. The portions for different kinds of loaves are kept in separate areas of the work surface, a quiet order that the bakers maintain without much apparent thought, the arrangement emerging naturally from long repetition. The round, flat loaves are shaped first. A portion of dough is pressed down with the heel of the palm, firmly and evenly, the weight distributed across the whole hand so that the dough flattens without tearing. Then the baker works around the edge with the fingertips, pressing and rotating the round slowly, turning it a little with each pass, the motion continuous and gentle. The surface of the loaf smooths gradually under this attention, the rougher texture of the divided dough giving way to something more even and closed, the exterior sealed softly against the work surface, and then lifted and turned and smoothed on the other side as well. These round, flat loaves are among the most common forms produced in a large bakery, practical in their simplicity, easily stacked and counted, suitable for the daily grain rations distributed to workers and household members whose sustenance flows through the bakery's careful rhythms each morning. The elongated rolls require a slightly different motion. A smaller portion of dough is set on the board and rolled beneath both palms simultaneously, the baker applying gentle downward pressure, while moving her hands apart in slow, mirrored strokes, lengthening the dough gradually into a form that is roughly cylindrical, tapered at each end, where the palms naturally thin the dough as they move outward. The motion is repeated several times, each pass refining the shape a little further, smoothing any cracks that open at the surface with a dampened fingertip, working them closed with a small circular press. These rolls, compact and dense, are made in quantity for everyday use, their modest form requiring no mold and no particular ceremony, only the steady and attentive work of hands that have made the same shape many hundreds of times. The conical loaves, however, require something more. These are formed inside the tall ceramic molds that stand along one section of the work surface, narrow at the top and wider at their open base, fired from a pale reddish clay that has been used and washed and used again through many seasons of baking. The particular term by which such molds were known in their own time remains a matter of some scholarly discussion, but their form and purpose are well attested in the archaeological record. They are prepared carefully before the dough enters them. A baker takes each mold and runs a film of fat or a dusting of dry flour along the interior surface, working the coating down as far as the hand can reach, ensuring that the dough, once pressed inside, will be able to release cleanly after baking. The fat is applied with a folded cloth or with the fingers themselves, a thin and even film against the warm clay, the smell of it blending into the general warm sourness of the bakery air. Then the dough portion is taken up and pressed into the mold from the open base, worked upward into the conical interior with the fingers and with the knuckle of the thumb, pressing firmly to fill the narrowing cavity without leaving air pockets inside. The baker turns the mold slowly as the work proceeds, checking by touch that the dough has reached evenly into the narrow tip, pressing and smoothing and correcting until the interior is fully filled and the base is level and smooth. The finished mold is then set aside with care, standing upright among the others in a row, the dough hidden within the pale clay exterior, waiting for the heat that will transform it. Conical loaves shaped in this way carry a different weight in the life of the bakery. They are produced for purposes beyond the ordinary ration, for presentation at temple altars, for the tables of the household's senior members, for the ritual offerings that form part of the daily observances within the temple complex to which the bakery is attached. Their distinctive tall shape, so different from the humble rounds and rolls made in greater numbers, marks them as loaves of some ceremony, and the care taken in their preparation reflects this. The flour used for them may have been sifted more finely, the fat used to coat the molds applied with extra attention, the portions measured with a slightly greater precision. All around the work surface, the arrangement of shaped loaves grows slowly more complete. The flat rounds are laid onto wide ceramic trays in overlapping rings, close but not touching. The tray dusted first with a fine layer of flour so that the bottom surfaces will not adhere during their brief wait before the oven. The elongated rolls are set in rows beside them, their ends nearly touching the rim of each tray, packed with an economical density that makes the most of the available surface. The filled molds stand in their row, each one self-contained, the dough invisible within. A baker moves along the length of the work surface and checks each shaped form with a gentle hand, pressing softly where a surface has cracked and smoothing it closed, adjusting a round that has been placed too near its neighbor, pressing a roll lightly to confirm its firmness. It is quiet work, slow and deliberate, the hands finding and correcting small imperfections with the same careful attention that has governed every stage of the morning's labor. The oil lamps still burn at their intervals along the wall. The birds outside continue their soft and scattered chorus. The shaped loaves rest on their trays and inside their molds, waiting, as the dough has been waiting at every stage of this long morning, for what comes next. While the shaped loaves rest in their patient rows, the attention of the bakery turns toward the ovens. They stand along the far wall of the baking chamber, 3 large cylinders of fired clay, each one rising to roughly the height of a person's chest, their mouths open at the top, and a smaller opening near the base, providing the means by which fuel is fed and air is admitted to feed the flames. The outer walls of each oven are thick, many fingers' width of dense clay, built up in coils and smoothed flat over many seasons of use, their surfaces darkened by the accumulated soot of countless firings. At this hour of the morning, the interiors hold only the faint ghost of yesterday's heat, a residual warmth that can barely be felt when a hand is held over the open top. The clay has cooled through the long night to something approaching the temperature of the surrounding air, and what is required now is a slow, deliberate rebuilding of heat, not a sudden rush of flame, but a careful progression from cold clay to the sustained, even warmth that bread requires. The fuel for this work has been gathered and bundled in the days before, and it stands in a loosely organized stack along the adjacent wall, dry bundles of papyrus reed, their hollow stems making them quick to catch and quick to burn, long lengths of palm fiber twisted into loose ropes that will smolder and sustain a moderate heat, and shorter pieces of acacia wood, dense and slow burning, which will form the deeper base of the fire once the oven has begun to warm. The reed bundles are brittle and light in the hands, their outer surfaces pale and papery, their dried edges rustling softly whenever they are moved. The palm fiber is darker, faintly oily to the touch, carrying still the faint vegetable smell of the living tree from which it came. One of the bakers kneels beside the first oven and feeds a small bundle of dry reed through the lower opening. The reed slides easily into the dark interior, the pale ends disappearing into shadow. A second small bundle follows, arranged so that air can still move freely between the layers. The baker then brings a lit taper from one of the oil lamps, a thin sliver of wood that carries its small flame carefully across the bakery floor and touches it to the edge of the first bundle. The flame transfers quickly, running along the dry surface of the reed with a soft and eager sound, a low crackling that builds within a few moments into a small but steady burn. A thin line of pale smoke rises through the top opening of the oven and drifts gently toward the high mudbrick ceiling before dispersing. The first fire is modest, intentionally so. The clay of the oven walls must be warmed gradually, allowed to absorb the heat in stages, so that it will hold and radiate that heat evenly through the long bake ahead. A fire built too fast would heat the interior unevenly, leaving cold spots near the base or overheating the upper walls, while the lower clay remained cool. So the baker adds fuel in small increments, a little more reed, then a short coil of palm fiber laid carefully over the burning mass, then a small piece of acacia wood positioned where it will catch slowly from the palm fiber below it. Each addition is considered, deliberate, the hands working with the quiet confidence of long repetition. The same process begins at the second oven, and then the third, so that all three fires are lit within a short span of time, and will reach their working temperature together, or near enough together, that the morning's baking can proceed in an orderly sequence. The bakery, which has been cool and dim through the early hours of grinding and mixing and shaping, begins now to change its character. The warmth that the ovens release is subtle at first, barely more than a suggestion, but it accumulates steadily, pushing back the cool of the morning air, softening it, filling the space between the mudbrick walls with a gentle, encompassing heat that settles around the shoulders and the face like something familiar and reassuring. The orange glow from the mouths of the ovens grows brighter as the fires establish themselves. It reflects softly off the clay floor nearby and catches the lower edges of the work surface, lending the bakery an amber warmth that mingles with the yellow light of the oil lamps. The shadows shift as the flames move within the ovens, and the smell of the burning reed reaches every corner of the room, a clean, dry, slightly sweet smell, different from the sourness of the fermenting dough, lighter and more immediate, carrying with it a trace of the reed marshes along the river, where the papyrus once grew. As the fires deepen and the acacia wood takes hold, the baker in charge of the first oven checks the temperature in a way that long experience has made natural and reliable. A hand is held flat over the opening at the top of the oven, not touching the rim, simply resting in the column of rising heat, reading what the air against the palm and the back of the hand communicates about the state of the fire below. The hand is withdrawn after a few moments, and a brief judgment is made. It is warm, but not yet warm enough. The color of the interior walls is observed as well, the way the clay shifts from its cold gray-brown toward a deeper tone as heat penetrates the material, and then with greater heat still, toward a faint reddish cast visible in the deeper shadows of the oven's lower half. These are not colors that can be easily described to someone who has not spent many mornings watching them change, but to the baker who has done so, they are a clear and sufficient language. More palm fiber is added to the second oven, where the fire has been slightly slower to establish. A piece of acacia wood that has not caught properly is adjusted with a long, thin rod of hardened clay, nudged toward the burning center until it begins to smolder more reliably at one end. The fires in all three ovens are breathing steadily now, their appetite for fuel measured and consistent, and the baker moves among them with an attentive patience. Then, moving on again in the same calm circuit, the heat spreading through the bakery has by this time grown substantial. The flour dust on every surface has been warmed. The clay of the work surface carries the ambient temperature of the room. The shaped loaves on their trays have been sitting in this gentle warmth, their surfaces continuing to dry and firm in the way that prepares them for the oven's more intense and concentrated heat. The bakers who have been occupied with other small tasks, carrying water, trimming the wicks of lamps that have begun to dim, sweeping the accumulated flour dust from the corners of the room into a small pile near the doorway, pause now and again to look toward the ovens, reading their own quiet signals about how the heat is progressing. The moment of readiness is not announced by any external measure. There is no counting of time, no instrument to consult. It arrives through the accumulated sense of what the oven feels like when the clay has held its fire long enough and evenly enough to carry a loaf through its full bake without faltering, a heat that is full and steady and contained, radiating from the walls as much as from the fire itself, the interior a deep and even warmth that a careful hand, held briefly at the rim, recognizes without hesitation. The baker at the first oven holds a hand over the opening once more, and this time withdraws it with the calm certainty that the oven is ready. The morning has arrived at the moment the whole long preparation has been building toward. The first loaves to enter the oven are the flattest ones, the round, open discs of dough that have been resting on their ceramic trays, their surfaces now dry and faintly matte, holding the shallow impressions of the baker's final smoothing pass. A long, flat paddle worn smooth from long use and darkened with the residue of many hundreds of bakes, slides carefully beneath the first tray. The motion is practiced and steady, the baker keeping the paddle level, feeling the slight resistance of the tray's clay base against the wood, then drawing it forward and guiding it smoothly through the oven's wide mouth in one slow, continuous movement. The heat that meets the arms and face at this moment is dense and pressing, radiating from every direction at once from the oven's rounded interior walls, enveloping and sustained, a warmth that settles against the skin like the air inside a sealed granary on a summer midday. The tray settles onto the oven floor with a soft, firm sound, and the paddle is drawn back out, and the baker straightens and steps back, and the work of the fire takes over. The conical ceramic molds, each one holding its column of shaped dough, are placed differently. These are set directly against the inner walls of the oven, lean there at a slight angle in the way that experience has taught gives the most even distribution of heat around the clay's curved surface. The baker handles each mold with care, using folded cloth to protect the hands from the oven's radiating warmth, positioning each cone with deliberate attention before stepping back. There is a particular rhythm to this loading, a patience, each mold placed and considered before the next one is taken up. When the oven has received its full complement of loaves, the opening is partly covered, a ceramic slab or a section of flat clay drawn partway across the mouth to hold the heat inside while still allowing the fire at the oven's base to breathe. The second oven receives its loaves in the same way, the same movements repeated with the same calm attention, and then both ovens are sealed to the degree that the baker's judgment requires, and the bakery enters the particular quality of stillness that belongs to the long bake. Inside those sealed clay chambers in the dense amber heat that no eye can follow now, the transformation has already begun. The surface of each loaf which arrived into the oven still faintly soft, still yielding slightly to a careful press, begins almost immediately to change. The outermost layer of dough meets the radiating heat from the oven walls and from the floor beneath, and begins to firm and stiffen, setting into a crust that will grow progressively harder and darker as the bake continues. The Emmer wheat flour, with its particular qualities distinct from softer wheats, sets into this crust with a density and substance that is characteristic of Egyptian bread, a crust that is not merely a thin skin, but a solid, hard shell, capable of protecting the interior crumb through long storage in the warm, dry air of the bakery and the storerooms beyond. The color moves through its stages slowly, a pale gold at first, then a deeper amber, then as time passes and the heat sustains itself in the sealed chamber, a rich brown that in places along the bottom and the sides, where the clay wall is hottest, may deepen further still. The smell that begins to drift from the ovens within the first portion of the bake is distinct and unmistakable. The sharp, sour grain scent that has hung in the bakery air all through the long hours of fermentation and shaping begins to alter, softened, and then gradually replaced by something fuller and warmer, the complex round smell of grain undergoing its final transformation, caramelizing sugars and browning flour giving the air a sweetness that is not sharp or insistent, but gentle and pervasive, filling the bakery from the ovens outward, settling into the mudbrick walls and the wooden tools and the woven baskets stacked near the doorway. The morning air outside carries it too, drifting out through the open doorway into the compound beyond, into the brightening air of the early day. The bakers do not stand idle during the long bake. The fire at the base of each oven requires attention, not constant intervention, but a watchful management, the occasional addition of a small bundle of dried reed or a length of palm fiber to maintain the heat at a level that is sustained and even, rather than climbing or falling. Too much fuel added too quickly would drive the temperature higher than the loaves require, darkening the outer crust before the interior crumb has had time to set and firm through to its center. Too little, and the fire would begin to subside, the heat in the sealed chamber declining and leaving loaves only partly baked, their interior still dense and damp. The judgment required is continuous but quiet, a steady attending to the oven's signals rather than a series of decisive actions. The baker managing the fire feeds it in small increments, watching the smoke rising from the vent at the oven's top, feeling the radiant warmth at the oven's exterior wall with the back of a hand held briefly close, reading the color of the fire visible at the base, where the fuel rests. At a certain point, when enough time has passed, and the smell from the ovens has deepened to its fullest warm richness, the ceramic covering at the oven's mouth is drawn partly aside, and a loaf on its tray is drawn forward using the paddle, far enough to examine without fully removing it from the heat. The baker leans close and looks at the crust, its color, its firmness, the way it has set along its edges where the dough was thinnest. A careful tap with a fingertip, quick and practiced against the surface, communicates through long experience whether the interior has firmed sufficiently or whether the loaf needs to remain. It is likely that no single loaf is judged identically. The ones placed nearest the oven's interior wall will have received more direct heat than those resting on the floor away from the fire's base, and the rotation of trays, drawing some forward and pushing others back, ensures that each loaf passes through the hottest zones of the oven in its turn and emerges from the bake at a similar degree of doneness. The crumb that forms inside each loaf during this long, slow bake is dense and close, not the airy, open texture of a more lightly fermented or differently milled bread, but a solid, substantial interior that holds its moisture well and sustains a person through long hours of physical work. The fine particulate carried over from the grinding process, an inevitable and long familiar characteristic of bread made this way, is present within that crumb, part of the particular quality of the bread's texture, in a way that those who bake and eat it have always known. It is the bread that workers along the Nile have eaten for generations, the bread that sustains the compound from the highest to the most ordinary member of the household, and its denseness and its hard crust and its deep golden to dark brown exterior are not imperfections, but simply the nature of what it is, a bread suited entirely to its climate, its materials, and the life it nourishes. The ovens hold their heat, the fire breathes quietly at their base, and the morning moves gently forward around the long, patient work of the bake. When the moment comes, it comes quietly. There is no sudden announcement, no single signal that the baking is finished. Only the gradual accumulation of small signs that an experienced baker reads without thinking. As one reads a familiar task learned so deeply, it has passed beyond conscious attention. The color of the crust has deepened to its final shade, somewhere between warm amber and the rich brown of river mud at the height of summer. The smell rising from the oven's mouth has shifted from the sharp, lively scent of dough actively transforming into something rounder and more settled, a smell that fills the room completely and sits there like warmth itself. The surface of each loaf, where it was once yielding and uncertain to the touch of a careful fingertip, has become firm and sealed, a thing that has found its finished form and will not change further. And so the bakers move forward with their long paddles and their practiced hands, and the loaves begin to come out. The flat loaves come first, drawn from the ceramic trays with a sliding motion, the paddle worked gently beneath each one to loosen it from the surface it is baked against. They come free with a soft resistance, the crust having fused lightly to the tray in places, and each loaf is lifted clear and carried to the waiting reed mats laid out along one wall of the bakery, where the morning air moves slowly through the open doorway. The conical loaves in their tall ceramic molds require a different kind of attention. The mold must be tilted carefully, the loaf eased free by a slow rocking motion, the bread emerging narrow end first into the waiting hand of the baker, who turns it upright and sets it point down in the sand or against a rack so that it holds its shape as it cools. The elongated rolls come out last, arranged in their rows with the same deliberate steadiness that has governed every stage of the morning's work. Steam rises from every loaf as it meets the cooler air of the bakery. It rises in thin, pale threads from the scored or cracked lines of the crust, where the bread expanded during the bake, and it drifts upward and disperses in the still morning air, catching the light that comes now through the doorway with increasing steadiness. The morning is fully brightening outside, the sky above the mudbrick walls of the compound moving through its softest shades of gold and pale blue. The river somewhere beyond the walls, carrying that light on its slow surface. The birds that have been calling since just before dawn settling now into their ordinary mid-morning voices. Inside the bakery, the steam from the cooling loaves mingles with the warmth still radiating from the ovens, and the smell of bread fills every corner of the space, deep and full and complete. Arranged now in their rows on the reed mats, is a thing that draws the eye quietly and holds it. Each loaf carries its own particular range of tones, the underside paler where it rested against the tray, the upper crust or the sides a deep, even amber brown, darkening in places to something closer to the color of old wood or the dry earth of the desert margin. In the places where the crust cracked during the bake, The interior shows itself in a narrow line, and the crumb visible there is dense and close-grained, a warm off-white pressed tight against itself, holding the last of its moisture in the sealed interior, even as the crust begins to harden further in the open air. The bakers move among the cooling racks with an easy, measured pace. This is not a time of urgent work, but of quiet attention, a kind of slow and gentle accounting that follows naturally from the long labor of the morning. A hand is passed close to each loaf without touching it, feeling for the heat still rising, gauging how much time remains before the bread has cooled sufficiently to be handled and counted and distributed. Occasionally a loaf is lifted and turned, its underside examined, its weight felt briefly in the palm. A heavy loaf, holding its moisture, is a well-made loaf, and this is noted without words in the calm assessment of someone who has done this so many times that the judgment has become almost bodily. Among the rows of cooling bread, certain loaves are set aside with particular care. These are the loaves designated for the temple, the formal offerings that will be carried later to the offering tables as part of the daily ritual provisions of the household's religious obligations. Such loaves are not necessarily larger or more elaborately shaped than the others, though some may have been formed with greater attention to their proportions, but they are chosen from among the best of the batch, the most evenly baked, the most symmetrical, the loaves whose crusts are unbroken and whose forms are whole and clean. They are arranged separately, placed on a mat reserved for this purpose, and given a little more space around them, as if the air itself is acknowledging their particular destination. The rest of the loaves continue cooling in their ordered rows. The steam has thinned now, and the bakery holds its warmth steadily. Neither the fierce heat of the active bake, nor the coolness of the deep night, but something temperate and still and richly scented. The smell of finished bread is everywhere, in the cloth that hangs near the doorway, in the hair and linen garments of the bakers, in the very surface of the mudbrick walls, which have absorbed the breath of 1,000 mornings such as this one. Outside, the compound is waking fully, the sounds of the household moving through its morning routines, drifting over the walls, and the light is broad and even now across the reed mats and the rows of amber loaves resting quietly in the air, cooling slowly into the bread that will sustain another day along the Nile. The counting begins quietly, as it always does, with the arrival of the scribe. He comes in the middle of the morning, when the light is full and steady across the compound, carrying a small wooden pallet on which 2 cakes of ink rest beside a fine reed pen, and tucked beneath his arm, a roll of papyrus that has been used and reused, its surface bearing the faint traces of previous days' tallies beneath the fresh layer of smoothed clay pigment. He is a young man, perhaps, or a man of middle years whose role in the household is a familiar and settled one, and he moves into the bakery without ceremony, greeting the head baker with a brief inclination of the head, and settling himself near the cooling racks where the loaves lie in their rows. The counting is methodical. Each loaf is lifted gently, turned in the hands, assessed briefly by the baker who stands beside the scribe, and then set back into its place, or moved to one of the large shallow baskets lined with linen cloth that wait nearby on the floor. The scribe marks his tallies in a practiced hand, the numbers recorded not in the sprawling symbols of formal monumental inscription, but in the swift condensed marks of the hieratic script, which was widely used for administrative and practical records across many periods and institutional contexts. A running notation that captures quantities, categories, and destinations in compact strokes of dark ink across the papyrus surface. Egyptian administrative life depended upon this kind of careful accounting in a way that was woven deeply into the fabric of the society itself. Bread was not merely food in the context of a large household or a temple estate. It was currency, obligation, and evidence of order, and the records kept by scribes like this one served both practical and ceremonial purposes. To have distributed bread without counting it would have been to have left something important, unwitnessed, unconfirmed, unreal in the administrative sense. The numbers on the papyrus made the loaves legible to the institution they served. The loaves are sorted as they are counted. Those destined for the field workers are gathered in the largest baskets, broad, deep vessels woven from split reed and palm fiber. worn smooth along the rim from long handling. These loaves are the round, flat ones baked in quantity, solid and sustaining, their crusts dark and hard, their interiors dense with the kind of slow fermented crumb that holds together through a morning of carrying and arrives still firm enough to be eaten with a handful of dried figs or a small portion of lentils. The field workers will receive their rations when the sun reaches a certain point above the eastern bluffs, and the baskets must be ready and counted well before that hour. Beside them, in slightly smaller baskets, lined with fresh linen, the portions for the household servants are assembled. These loaves are much the same in composition, but perhaps a little more varied in form, some of the elongated rolls among them, a few of the smaller rounds, and the quantity allocated reflects the scale of the household's daily obligations, which the scribe knows by memory and by the markings on his papyrus, without needing to be reminded. The priestly portions are handled with particular care. The temple offering loaves have already been set aside on their dedicated mat. But among the remaining counted bread, there is also a portion reserved for the priests of the household shrine and for those members of the temple staff who receive their sustenance through the estate's ration system rather than directly from the temple stores. These loaves are wrapped individually in clean white linen cloth, folded with a simple neatness, and stacked in a flat-bottomed basket whose interior has been lined with a fresh layer of cloth. The wrapping is not merely for cleanliness, though cleanliness is part of it. It also marks these loaves as belonging to a different category, a distinction made visible in cloth and gesture. The craftsmen's portions, those belonging to the woodworkers, the potters, the weavers, the leather workers who serve the household's various practical needs, are counted out with the same careful attention, their basket assembled and set in its place among the others. Each basket will travel a different path through the compound once the distribution begins, carried by the youngest members of the bakery staff or by servants sent from the various workshops and quarters to collect the day's allotment. When the counting is complete and the scribe's papyrus bears its full notation, there is a brief, quiet moment in which the head baker and the scribe compare the morning's yield against the expected quantities. It is a calm and deliberate process, the two of them standing near the last of the cooling racks and speaking in low voices. If the yield is very close to expectation, as it generally is when the emmer has been of good quality and the grinding thorough, nothing much is said beyond a small affirmation. If there is a slight shortfall, it is noted on the papyrus with the same neutral care as everything else, a fact among facts, recorded without distress, and set beside all the other observations of the morning. Then the distribution begins, and this is perhaps the most quietly purposeful part of the morning's long work. The baskets are carried to the low stone threshold at the bakery's outer doorway, or in some cases to a designated point along the compound wall, where a broad, flat-topped mudbrick ledge serves as a natural counter. The bakers who carry out this task move back and forth between the interior of the bakery and the threshold with an easy, practiced rhythm, setting baskets down and returning for the next, with the steady motion of people long accustomed to this work. On the other side of the threshold, figures from across the compound arrive in a loose procession, not crowded, not hurried, but arriving in the natural order of the morning, each group knowing when their portion will be ready, as they must leave earliest to reach the outer edges of the estate, before the sun climbs high and the air grows heavy. They receive their baskets, or their counted individual portions with a quiet practicality, a brief acknowledgement, and then they are gone through the compound gate, their figures carrying the broad shadows of early morning across the dusty ground. The household servants come in smaller clusters, and the exchange here is gentler, more lingering, because these are people who move through the same compound walls each day, and who know the bakers by name and by long familiarity. There is an ease to this part of the distribution, a quality of recognition in the small gestures and the soft words exchanged across the threshold, the kind of ease that belongs to mornings repeated over many seasons. The craftsmen collect their portions at intervals between their work, the potter arriving with flour dust already on his forearms, the weaver with threads caught in her linen, each one pausing in the middle of a day that is already well underway to receive the bread that makes continued work possible. By the time the last basket has been carried out and the last counted portion distributed, the bakery threshold is quiet again, and the compound beyond it has absorbed its bread and moved on into the business of the day. The scribe has folded his papyrus and departed, his notation complete and dry, the morning's yield committed to the record. The baskets that remain inside are the empty ones, resting on their sides near the door, and the reed mats where the loaves cooled now bear only the faint oily impressions of crusts that have long since been carried away into the life of the household and the fields and the workshop and the shrine, sustaining each corner of the world that this small bakery serves. The bakery is quiet now in a way that feels different from the quiet of the hours before dawn. That earlier stillness was a held breath, full of the anticipation of work not yet begun, the flour unmeasured, the fire unlaid, the long day curled up and waiting to unfold. This quiet is the other kind, the settled, exhaled stillness of a day's work brought to its completion, the kind of quiet that has weight and substance and warmth folded all through it. The ovens cool slowly, as large clay structures always do. They do not release their heat all at once, but give it up in long, gradual increments, the clay walls contracting almost imperceptibly, settling back into their resting state as the afternoon progresses. The mouths of the great cylindrical ovens stand open now, their interiors dimming from the fierce orange-white of baking heat down through deeper shades of amber and ochre, hour by hour. A baker passing near them will still feel that warmth pressing gently outward, a soft invisible presence in the air of the room, and the clay itself, if touched lightly with the back of a hand, still carries the memory of fire. The stone querns rest exactly where they were left after the morning's grinding, one tilted slightly against the low mudbrick platform where it is worked each day, another laid flat, its surface pale with the fine residue of emmer flour that has settled into every small pit and groove in the stone over many years of use. There is a kind of worn familiarity to the look of grinding stones that have been worked through season after season, and the flour dust that coats them now is only the latest layer of something very old. A fine powder of that same pale flour has settled across the surrounding floor, across the lower portions of the walls, across the rims of the wooden troughs that collected the meal each morning, across the lids of the ceramic storage jars. It softens every surface it touches, muting colors slightly, rounding edges, giving the whole interior of the bakery a gently muted, powdery quality in the afternoon light. The bakers move through this soft atmosphere with an ease that belongs to people whose most demanding work is behind them. There is still work to do, but it is the slower, quieter work of preparation and care, the tending of tools and spaces so that tomorrow's morning can begin as smoothly as this one did. One baker sweeps the grinding area with a bundle of stiff palm fibers bound together at one end, working the flour dust back toward the edges of the floor in long, easy strokes, the motion loose and repetitive in the manner of tasks that have been done so many times they no longer require thought. The dust rises in small pale clouds around her feet and then settles again, and she sweeps it once more, methodically, until the floor near the querns is as clean as it will get. The tall, tapering ceramic molds that shape the conical loaves offered to temples and households of higher standing are carried in a group to where water has been left standing in a wide, low basin near the doorway. They are lowered into the water one by one and left to soak, the dried remnants of flour and fat softening gradually as the water works its way into every interior surface. Soaking them this way loosens what baking hardens and makes the next day's preparation easier. The molds will be clean and ready, their interiors smooth again when they are needed. They rest in the basin through the remainder of the afternoon, the water around them turning slightly milky as the flour residue dissolves into it, and the pale clay of the molds darkens as they absorb moisture, taking on a deeper, cooler tone. The flat ceramic trays are wiped down with damp cloth, and the long wooden paddles used to load the ovens are inspected carefully for any cracking or splitting that the heat may have caused along the grain of the wood. Those that have served well are set aside for tomorrow. Any that show signs of weakening at their handles or along their broad, flat faces are placed in a separate pile to be repaired or replaced. The wooden mixing bowls are rinsed and turned upside down on a low wooden rack to drain and dry. The woven reed mats that held the cooling loaves are shaken out through the doorway, and the small dry fragments of crust that fall from them scatter in the warm afternoon air and disappear into the dust of the compound beyond. The remaining grain is seen to with particular care. Any Emmer wheat that was measured out but not yet ground is returned to its storage vessel and the ceramic lid pressed back into place and sealed again at its edges with a thin layer of damp clay, pressed smooth with a thumb. A simple gesture that keeps moisture and insects from reaching what is stored inside. The large storage jars that hold the day's unmilled reserves are checked once more. Their lids secure, their bodies undamaged, their contents protected against the warmth of the afternoon. Grain properly stored in sealed ceramic in this way will keep well, and the care taken with these vessels is the same care taken every other afternoon, part of an unbroken chain of small careful acts that stretches back through every day the bakery has operated, and forward into every day it will continue to operate. Outside the low doorway of the bakery, the afternoon light lies broad and warm across the compound. Beyond the mudbrick walls, the river catches that light and holds it in long, shifting planes of brightness, the water moving at its own deep and constant pace, carrying with it the slow memory of every season it has passed through and every field it has fed. The light on the water is very clear at this hour, arriving at that particular quality of clarity that settles over the valley when the morning's activity has subsided and the day begins its long, golden drift toward evening. Inside, the smell of bread is still present in the air of the bakery, not the sharp, urgent smell of loaves just drawn from the oven, but something gentler and more diffuse, a warm residual scent absorbed into the mud-brick walls and the wooden tools and the woven reed mats and the clay of the ovens themselves. It is the smell of a place where bread has been made for a very long time. Layered into the substance of the building, the way years layer themselves quietly into any structure that has been inhabited and worked in and cared for across many seasons. The baker who first lit the small oil lamp in the deep dark before dawn sits now in the shade near the doorway, her hands resting quietly in her lap, the long work of the day folded peacefully around her. The stone querns are still, the ovens are cooling, the loaves are long since carried away into the life of the household and the temple and the field, and the bakery rests, gently and completely, in the slow warmth of the afternoon, one more day of its long and quiet story told.